My name is Shawn Creeden. I'm an artist. I live here in Portland, Oregon at the moment. And disclaimer, I am not by any stretch of the imagination an indigenous scholar. I have a lot of interests in human beings and nature and a lot of other things that I think swirl around this piece that I'm going to be talking about. Yeah, I'm also a graduate student over at PSU in my second year. Woo woo. And I'm going to try to do a little experiment here where there's a lot of stuff happening in my mind and ideas are attached and floating around this object, so I'm going to try to reveal a little bit of that to you guys and sort of map out the different things that this little tiny little artifact make me think about. The piece, as you can see, on this beautiful enlargement, it's just kind of called Birch Bark binding. This is sort of like an anthropological sort of descripting of the piece. The Ojibwe tribe is a tribe of indigenous Americans that mostly set around sort of like the Northeast and the Great Lakes area. They share a language with like the Chippewa and other Algonquin tribes. And not a big surprise. Oh yeah, there it is right there. Boom. The beautiful birch, one of my favorite trees. Growing up in New England, we had a lot of them. Birch trees sort of exist in this sort of boreal, kind of northern reaches. I grew up right there, so deep in the birch zone. And I've always found them to be really, really beautiful, just beautiful trees to look at, beautiful in a group when you're hiking through the woods and you come across a stand of birch trees. The light is golden and flickering, and the leaves are silver and green and blowing in the breeze. And then you look out at this. Oops. Wait, okay. You know, it's almost it's such a contrast to the kind of deciduous green and conifers that you see in New England. It's such a stark contrast, and I've always really had a fondness for it as a young kid. So, hold on, just gotta get my notes open. So at the beginning of this thing that we're doing is the birch bark piece. The piece itself. The B. Birch bark, bitten birch bark. So among the things that I think that this piece, first of all, it's so tiny, it's so hidden amongst so many other beautiful, kind of more flashier, like some of these textiles. It's sort of this subtle little specimen, and that I'm a birder. I don't know if anyone else here looks at birds or goes hiking and kind of like looks for things or finds things there. But this immediately tickled that kind of, ooh, I just discovered something like a beautiful singing wren in the underbrush or something like that. Like this sort of understated, beautiful little delicate object. And so the things that I consider, oh man, these pens are way too narrow. This thing might not work. We might have to abandon this. Both the material, the bark itself, as material, I think is interesting. I'll go into all of these things. We'll sort of like develop as this talk sort of goes. But there's a couple kind of like general there's the material itself. There is the aspect of the human interaction. This thing comes into it happens along sort of a culture, human culture, and nature. This sort of, I don't see a real distinct divide. I see it a little bit more as a continuum. And it is kind of beautifully situated right in the middle of this that I think this moment of this interaction is born out of this moment there. I should maybe describe how this thing gets made. It is that interaction that I find so fascinating. It's this really intimate, you have to know about what the right time of year to harvest the birch is. Families would go out together, and it'd be just sort of a bonding experience to go out, and in the springtime is the best time to harvest the birch. If you go during a certain time and you find the right tree and you're looking for a tree that has no knots in it because you want like big sheets of these beautiful, you want big sheets of bark, you can actually you basically cut down the birch tree itself, and the bark almost pops off. It has this like snapping kind of like unveiling, or it happens in the springtime, so it's this sort of, it almost is like shedding of the clothing style of moment. And so you cut a line down the tree, and this can be done sustainably. It's possible and was tradition amongst these tribes to harvest in a way that did not kill the tree. You're not trying to what's called girdle the tree, where you basically cut a line all the way around the midriff of the tree. But you can basically cut down to the Cambrian, which is the little living layer below the bark. It pops off, and a few years later, the bark has been replaced. So this kind of idea of sustainability is interesting to me. How this art form, there's an intimate knowledge of between humans and nature. You have to know where these trees are, what the right kind of tree looks like, how to cut it, and then comes the preparation moment where you have to extract the bark apart into these like super thin pieces of tissue paper. So there's this, and if any of this doesn't make any sense or whatever, shout out questions. This is like a malleable space here, this membrane. So you pull the sheets apart. Fast forward a little bit. You pull the sheets apart, and you get, this is the outside, this is the inside of the bark. Once you've taken it off the tree, this kind of continues to go down into these little tissue papers. And if you have a tree with no knots, then you have a nice big sheet. And then this was an art form particularly prominently practiced by women in the society. And they would use, so then you take the bark and you fold it up. You can see in the example how the piece has been sort of folded into triangles. And then this is a woman named Half Moon Woman. Her name is Pat Broderer. She's one of there's probably less than a dozen practitioners of this art form that are still alive in the world. And she has been keeping it alive and teaching more indigenous youth and people of all kinds about this art form. And so then you take this little, you fold up the birch bark, and then you, using your eye teeth, you like nibble on it. And I think that that's such a like tender an intimate interaction with nature as well. It not only requires this sort of knowledge, but then you have this moment where you're sort of like nibbling at the trees like underwear, or at the trees like the under layers of its skin, because it's kind of like thrown open, whatever. It's kind of like exterior, and then you're nibbling on it, but it's not really sustenance, and you can't see what you're doing. It's happening in your mouth, and a lot of these artists would talk about how they would. It's a thing that you do specifically where you're not looking at it. You're seeing. One woman described it as, "I see the designs with my eye teeth," because your canines are the ones that you're actually using to sort of perforate it. And then the result is this beautiful, I see kind of echoes of embroidery in this as well, and sort of lace making. Embroidery has long been a thing I've been interested in and is part of my practice. I make embroideries of varying sizes and complexities.
You're saying that all of this is from teeth?
Yeah, it's all from teeth. So they take, you would take kind of like the sheet, fold it up. It's sort of like if you make a snowflake, you cut the snowflake and then you kind of flow it open, and it is this symmetrical design. So so it's all of these marks except for the classic kind of birch lines. It's all done with teeth and one tooth. And just by kind of moving it around in the mouth, and they can get more and more complex. This is just a beautiful shot of, this is what it looks like where I grew up. Birch has many uses. We'll get to that. Here's an example of kind of how you would peel the bark away from each other, and you get this very clean. These kinds of, if you can imagine a tree that serves, it's like a miracle tree. This thing serves so many purposes. Babies are born and placed in birch, basically like swaddled in birch bark. People who have passed and who are being either buried or burned will also be wrapped in birch bark. So birch has this, and this is also across cultures, like throughout that whole line on the earth. One thing that I'm interested, where this kind of matched up with another interest of mine, is in my family's from Ireland, and in the Druidic tradition. They have this sort of beautiful secret alphabet where all the letter forms represent like a letter, but also a plant, a tree, or an herb. And so the first letter of the alphabet is called bit, and that represents a birch tree. It represents beginnings, new life, youth, changes, and throughout my research, birch is very, very prominently associated with those ideas of rebirth and of a changing and of a transition. And that also speaks about birch. I think that reflects birch as within its ecological role as well. It's what's called a pioneer tree. So when there's a burn or a fire or man-made whatever, or there's a disturbance within the environment, birch trees are among some of the first plants that start to colonize that area. So they are the first ones there, and then they're not super duper long lived. So they produce an environment that then there's still lots of light. Other types of trees that maybe need more light can flourish, and then you get into this sort of this next phase of forest building. But the birch trees are sort of very much at the forefront of that, and so you get you swaddle your babies in it, you bury your friends and family in it when they've passed. It's also, this is like the world's first paper. Like before people created papyrus and fibers and started birch bark was used as a substrate for drawings, for writing down stories, keeping a history, and also as a sketchbook, which is another reason why I really love the sort of casuality of pieces like this. Birch bark biting was used to sort of like test out patterns that would then be used in quill work or beadwork and things like that on other garments. And it was also used to, the birch bark biting was used to record stories and record historical events within a given tribe, as well as sort of like a friendly competition. Like the women of the tribe would go out and gather food and materials, and then maybe when they take a break, sit down, and it's like, oh, who can make like the most elaborate, most beautiful birch bark biting while we're sitting here. And the material is so delicate that if you unfold it too fast, it will just like tear and destroy. So it really is. It's like nibbling on tissue paper, serving many purposes. Sustainable death.
So are there historical native drawings, paintings, whatever, that are surviving?
Yeah, actually, there are some, and this is a great example of that. This one's about a little over 100 years old, and there are people working today. I think this is a slightly more contemporary one. A lot, you can imagine, did not survive. This was an art form that was outlawed by colonizing American governments, and you can imagine it's very easy to destroy. Birch bark also making great kindling if you're stuck in the woods. So this was yet another aspect of indigenous culture that was attempted to be stamped out and very nearly is. And we are sort of at this, again, this sort of like possible rebirth moment, a moment of transition, a moment at the edge of things where birch really thrives. So my sort of, I think that there's a lot to be gained from looking back at indigenous lifeways, including art, and how magical a thing that you can get, and how magical and intimate that experience of every point along the route of getting to it, from the moment of harvest where you're out with your family and everyone's having fun and you cut the thing and you carry all the things back. And then you turn it into, part of it goes towards a canoe, part of it goes towards making baskets. This sort of idea of like using all of it and having a really flexible mind and a flexible material enough to be able to be like, oh, how else can we put this to use? How else can we use this sort of simple material? So not a terribly lot, not a overwhelming amount of these have survived past American colonization, unfortunately. Oops, I don't know how to get back in there. Can I just go back? They'll take care of it. But again, this act of kind of like intimately nibbling this thing, sort of things that we now know about birch bark include that there are compounds in it that are really good for our teeth. If you break like a young birch branch and sniff it, you'll get almost like a wintergreen, kind of like a mint smell. And actually, for a long time, I don't know if this is still the case, but like oil of wintergreen that they would use in toothpaste or shampoo or whatever actually came from birch. And so there's this sort of the material and the action, there's like more connections than like we're just now with our science starting to realize like, oh yeah, that's why the teeth were good, is because you're chewing on birch bark, or whatever. Things that human beings have known for a long time before this point. And it's also it being meditative is another. I see parallels to like Eastern visual vernacular traditions, like mandalas and sort of like a meditative practice, like recentering yourself, sort of like focusing all your attention on like the point between your teeth as you're just sort of like, deet, 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 deet. I think that's a really beautiful meditative practice, creative in that moment, and also along with compounds that are good for teeth, like birch is super medicinal. The leaves can be turned into like a diuretic tea, and there are like you could things they would people would like smoke meat inside of the bark and do all these different kind of uses, but that's a little bit less about healing. Pattern, practice, story, tools, oil of wintergreen. This just reads like a spell I'm casting right here. Birch tar, like there's like so many components, and another thing that really struck me about this is it's sort of like very, very early, ephemera, like a sort of like early printed material that has like a limited sort of distribution or limited lifespan, and how it kind of, like a lot of these artifacts that we're surrounded with, sort of challenge our contemporary notion of like archivality and like what are these materials made of? How can we keep these for forever for posterity? There's like much less of a focus or a concern on with works like these, or probably with a lot of the works that are surround us right now, and it strikes me as a thing that one could collect, or I don't know, make them for your friends and trade them. That sounds like fun if anyone wants to do that. I see with my delicate peeling toothpaste additive. Does anyone have any questions?
You tried doing it yourself?
I have, and I don't think I had a thin enough piece of bark. I was really shocked. I thought I had kind of like separated it, but I think there's probably like 2 or 3 more layers of separation that one gets to like get down to this this very, very, very tiny thin little level of it. Also, my designs like just looked like garbage. Like it made me like with the ones that I was seeing, or like that Half Moon Woman would make. They're so it's like it looks like a lace, like an amazing lace doily, and there are all sorts of different. They'll use animal patterns, plant patterns. People will show up in them. Different spirits, maps. They would make kind of sort of like they would map out an area, in these things. So it's a wide range of uses come out of this, both this tree and this interaction, and sort of, I think, the relationship that these communities had with nature.
Do you think there were classic patterns or common patterns? You know how a quilt?
Yeah. I think that there were my fairly limited research. It seems like it was sort of not regional necessarily, but there are like it is sort of a standard. Like you fold it in a certain number of ways. I think it's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It's like 16 folds or something like that. Is kind of a traditional one of that. But yeah, I don't quite know.
I like, if the mom was teaching the kid, would they, teach this pattern?
Oh yeah.
How is it taught?
It's basically taught. I've watched some. There's a whole additional kind of like weird dark YouTube hole of like, oh, I want to know a little bit more about birch bark biting. Let's watch some YouTube videos. And then you watch these videos, and it's like some sort of like like an event, like a powwow or some kind of thing, and Half Moon Woman is sitting there at the table, and it very much also reminded me of this some of those pieces on that far wall over there that sort of reverse and comment upon that like photographer photographing the other kind of like and the videos were very strange, but there were a couple where she was instructing people, and it's like, how do you teach someone to embroider? You just have them like do it over and over and try. Like there's a long amount of biting before you get to something of like this or that complexity.
Do you think this was, used for something, or?
Yeah, I would say this something like these would be like what I was saying about like a sketchbook or working out kind of pattern ideas for quill work or for bead work. This kind of reminds me, looks something like that. You could see it's sort of like working that idea out, and then it ends up on another garment or something like that.
You're saying this is more a sketchbook than a finished work, historically?
It is. The technique is used in that way as well. I could only posit what this one specifically would be used for, but like that idea of a sketchbook or of like keeping them and having sort of a record of one's own meditations in nature is my romanticized like Anglo mind working. I work for that.
Do you know anything about the installation piece up at the Arboretum, the birch grove there?
Oh no! Is it out in the park, or is it in the?
It's just above the winter garden, if you know what the winter garden is. A little copse of birch trees. Actually an installation piece, but I wondered more about it.
Whoa! Well, we should go on a field trip after this. Everyone grab their flashlights. I would do that. That's awesome. I don't know about that, but you said it's above the winter garden in the Arboretum. I'm going there tomorrow. Yeah. Have you been there at different times of year?
For sure, and different times of day. It's set up, of course, there are, I don't know how many trees are there, but all of them, at different times of day are hit with light, and as that trees across change, that changes, et cetera, et cetera. So.
Yeah. Late afternoon is a really beautiful time of day to stand in a birch copse. It's that like yellow and the white and the green. It's very scintillating.
Is there something about this practice that resonated with your own?
Yeah, definitely. It's the parallels to embroidery were really apparent for me, and also I think that another part of my practice, my visual practice, I make sculptures and drawings and whatever I want, and then I also have a pretty robust sort of plant-focused practice. I play with plants, work with plants, help people with their plants, plant maintenance is like an ever-present part of my life. I have a lot of plants. I have so many plants, and like carrying them around a lot is like a big part of the practice. So there is this kind of intimate relationship. Like people would go back to the same copes of trees, to the same tree, even from generation to generation. And that kind of like intimate knowledge of a given non-human entity, and then being able to craft or create like a cultural artifact out of that thing and that relationship without destroying it, I think is sort of a thing that I'm striving for in my practice. Trying to find a way that's congruous for me and sustainable for everything around me, that that still provides me with a lot of flexibility, you know, like that. Yeah, I want to make like something in the basket column. I want to make something in the canoe column. You know, like there's a lot of different, and that kind of like flexibility and versatility and imagination and tenderness and yeah, that kind of the intimacy of that nibbling moment, I would say, is something that I strive for in my practice. I don't know if I'm quite there yet. I think I need to go hang out with Half Moon Woman for a couple decades and get better at it. Let's see if I have any other notes. The version of this mind map that I already drew in my notebook is already, I'll leave this open so people can see it. I also have some books over here as well, as we're, you know, later on, as we're milling about, some different books about that I used in, and draw from my research, not only for this topic, but also in my practice. There's a book of medicinal and useful herbs over there. There's some tree identification guides that I use when I go hiking, or when I used to work at Portland Nursery to try to help me like memorize, like do my homework and memorize the trees. And then also some books about Druidic history, as I was mentioning too, about the Om written language, which is really beautiful. And yeah, so it felt like a lot of things were swirling around this thing that is almost in camouflage over here, you know, like it's the sort of taupe off-white thing sitting in a thing that is all off-white. It's almost camouflaged or hidden from your typical museum goer who would just like spend 10 seconds in front of a thing. And it's also one of like the few objects in here that has a didactic label, which I thought was really interesting, and very useful for me. I think I had seen birch bark biting before, but maybe once or twice, and then when I saw it here, I was like, oh, what was going on with that? And then that has led to a whole bunch of other investigations, and yeah, so that sort of that close attentive look as you're walking through either a forest or a museum or the hallway or whatever it is, that kind of attention to an otherwise semi-hidden detail is very much a part of the practice, like finding a thing, not really like searching or seeking, but you know, coyote meanders aimlessly and then bumps into a thing and then changes the world or something. That's kind of how I view it.
So did the birch biting discovery on your part, did that lead to did you say embroidery?
I have been doing that. I've been doing that for some time, probably like 10 years or something like that. But that similar kind of, I feel like there's a similar aesthetic in that, sort of like with embroidery. I don't know how many people have done embroidery in here, but the kind of like classic goal is to make you want like consistency. You want to make it look like a little rope. You want these tiny little consistent kind of marks along the cloth, and this just screams as having that kind of level of screams. Doesn't really scream, but it sort of like whispers hoarsely, delicately. That kind of like that exact same sort of consistent, tiny little mark making. Yeah.
So are you more in the school of like a rigorous tradition of like craft, or more into like the Ann Wilson sloppy craft kind of thing?
I think there's space for both.
Well, I'm not saying.
Yeah. But in terms of me,
Yeah, so you. Who are you?
I would say I'm kind of a little bit more on that sloppy, or like, a little freewheeling, we'll say.
You know Ann Wilson. Right?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that there's like things to be pulled forward from traditions, and there's like respect to be paid, and like I don't know what it seems like that would be hella fraught if I was to become, if I was just to be, oh, now I'm just start doing birch bark bindings, everybody make these huge, like that. I think that there's like conversations about, but I think that there's things to be taken forward from that, those relationships and that knowledge base, and then I'll be in my studio like gnawing on a piece of plastic or something. I don't know what I'm going to be doing in there.
Are you exhibiting your work anywhere locally?
Yes, I am, including in this building across the way. Tomorrow evening, there's going to be the opening of a beautiful installation. Libby Warble has taken over the top floor of the contemporary wing, and I have some plant work up there. So that has been one of the places where I place that work is in institutional, sort of like an institutional context that challenges the institution. Like plants, you're not really supposed to have plants in the museum, but we're moving forward and plunging into that awesome world. And then I also have a show, like I said, I'm getting my master's degree at PSU, and I have a show up right now in the Outzen Gallery, which is in Newburger Hall, right along the park blocks there, on the second floor, and that is open Monday to Friday, 10 to 5. And that is a very large, the room is probably maybe about the size of this space, maybe slightly smaller, and big room, big, beautiful north-facing windows, beautiful. And I have introduced this sort of invasive orange petroleum-based sort of vine form. Still trying to figure out whether it's like what categories it fits into, like life form or something else. But so the ground is covered in this like thick mat of this crunchy, sort of like plastic foliage leaves. It's sort of autumnal, and then there are some sculptures in there as well.
More or less an installation.
Yeah, more and less. Yeah, I do. Yeah. I think in terms of these like systems, I think a lot, and wanting to create an encompassing, cohesive environment. Like I think I'd say like a little more environmental, both in terms of the external world, like the woods and stuff, but also in terms of the environment of my studio, for example, which is a very specific environment with a very specific set of like climactic conditions, we'll say, and materials involved there, and then the a museum or a gallery as an environment, and how to. I spend a lot of time kind of like poking around the edges, like, oh, what's behind this door? Like, oh, what's back over here? And sort of like seeking a new ground, sort of. In this, which is another sort of parallel to the birch tree. Seeking out an unused space. Melanie can probably talk herself hoarse about my sort of shared space. If I see a space that's not being used, it's going to get used somehow for something. And so...
Not a minimalist.
Yeah, more and less. I don't know. Who knows? I'm a human being. I think Yeah, I don't know. Still, the jury is still out. I don't know. Would you say I'm a minimalist? I don't know. I don't think so.
I think in terms of lifestyle
Yeah.
philosophy,
Yeah.
minimalist, but
Yeah.
I think you are a maximalist in your work and
Yeah.
in your spaces that you have.
Yeah, I would say that. Yeah, my studio, one of the
That makes sense. I was just saying this or that.
yeah. One of my prompts in my first year last year was like, oh, what is critical biomass in my studio? Like, how many plants can I physically fit in here before it becomes like completely untenable? And so I had plants like on the floor, up on things, hanging, and I would kind of creep around through the studio like a creature, like a prosimian or something like that, and just like moving about and tending, like always everything needed to be tended constantly. So there's this sort of again, like care and maintenance and being a part of the environment, and me affecting the environment. Like, I've constructed this thing, obviously, but also allowing it to affect me back. Like, how am I moving my body through the space now? How am I like structuring my day? How am I structuring my week so that all of the needs of these things get met and continue to thrive and continue to like give me back? Like, it's like pouring energy and intent and love into a thing, and then that just totally gets reflected back at you, is what I'm finding. Yeah, in my research or my search. I feel like I'm not researching, I'm just searching. Yeah.
Here in the Pacific Northwest, is there anything that comes close to being an equivalent? Cedar bee? Something else?
Cedar, especially in its like many uses and its sort of like spiritual importance and like ritual usages and things like that. Yeah, yeah. Oh yeah, I guess that's true too. Yeah.
It's not, it falls apart.
It falls apart and it has a different, yeah. The conditions here are I mean, there are birch trees that will grow here. But I would say I was studying last year with Judy Bluehorse Skelton, who's a fantastic instructor, an amazing human being over at PSU, and I was asking her about some of these things last year, and she said that this particular art form is not particularly common in this area. I'm trying to remember what she did say. A lot more beadwork.
But the birch in the Northwest would work for similar enough to birch?
There's only one way to find out.
Yeah, there is.
We got to go out there in the spring. Usually it's called Betula papyriferus is like the Latin name for the paper bark birch, which is the one that has that kind of very wide distribution, especially in North America. And that's the one that has that really, really good. But that's a great question. There are some kind of beautiful, there's another Betula species that it's like redder. The bark is almost like a shiny red. And that would be gorgeous to see someone nibble on that. Be really beautiful.
When you fold, you can actually fold it that many times and it doesn't crack.
Yeah, it's
Can do that.
yeah, it's Half Moon Woman has like a 13-point, her secret like 13-point system for unfolding it so that it doesn't just get obliterated. But yeah, it's so thin and it is like these creases look pretty sharp, like someone's like, and when I tried to do it, I put a pretty sharp crease in it because how else do you fold it 8 times or whatever, yeah, it takes it. It's like almost inexplicable how it takes it. I don't.
Spring, though, you're saying
That's when the harvest time, especially, and actually you can totally like fallen logs is a great place to also find this material. because birch trees, like the outer bark is actually like one of the last parts of the tree to rot. The tree sort of rots out from its soft center. So if you find a big log in the woods, you just whack, whack, chop, chop, pull it off, and it can stay viable for a long time, because it's also, harkening back to some of its uses, it's also not antiseptic, but very sterile. It's a very sterile material because it's like the under layers of your skin, so that's one reason why it's like, oh, you catch the baby, put the baby in the thing, like, don't have to worry about it. Put the baby in the thing. Wait, what was the question? Did I make that question up, or was there a question there?
You got involved with like paper making,
Paper making. I have not yet.
that to me seems like it would be an actual progression.
Yeah.
Using alternative materials for paper pulp.
Yeah. I think that's super interesting. I wish I knew more about that.
Some people in town that know a lot about that.
Yeah, I would imagine all of there's so much printing and paper. Yeah, C3 initiative up in St. John's, they have a paper making residency. I should check that out. Yes.
Can you describe the pieces that you're going to have in the contemporary wing?
Oh yeah, so actually the show is a group show that brings together. So Libby's she's the curator. The overarching sort of framework of what she's doing is the question is like, who gets to be in a museum? Who doesn't get to be in a museum? How can these things be sort of challenged? How can the institution be challenged? And so her year of programming, this first show is all adults with developmental disabilities. And so like people who, like if anyone knows Project Grow here in town, she's gone to a couple of different groups or nonprofits that work with developmentally challenged adult communities, and they're like, she's like, oh, who's ready for this show? And so there's a absolutely spectacular, like I walk into that room and I was like, shit, I don't even know what I'm doing. This person's already doing it. And the work is really beautiful up there. There's paintings, sculpture, installation work. There's going to be concerts all year long. And so my work in there involves a series of plants that I've been caring for quite some time. There's a 13-foot tall Schefflera, this kind of like umbrella plant. There's some hanging stuff. If you go up there and you see foliage, it's my foliage. Yeah. But there's sort of that idea of the like invasive studio practice, or like, getting my things into all sorts of different places. And maybe it's not a sculpture, but it is this other thing that I have put just as much, if not more, work into than I would, whatever my sculptures maybe.
When you sculpt with plants, what other types of materials do you include in your sculptures, and how do you keep the plants alive?
Keeping the plants alive is ideally there's a testing that's going out with this going on with this project as well, where like relinquishing that care is like really challenging. I'm sure like anyone who's actually had like a child or a pet can talk about this. But typically I do it myself. I keep the things alive. I will go in and, you'll have to come to a workshop someday and I can go through the whole like 2-hour plant care rigmarole. And then other materials that I use, I try to combine, so I'm like looking at this human culture nature divide, and I'm interested in what's going on in here, but given our sort of materials of the day, like how much plastic there is in the world, how much sort of like when I go on a hike, there's just like, you'll be so deep in the woods and there's just like weird errant neon trash just like in there in the underbrush. And so that and my kind of traditional arc has always been like filled with rage and like humanity is the devil, like what are we doing, just destroying the environment. And now I still think that's true, and I think more people than just me are now realizing it, which it really like takes a load off. It's no longer just my cross to bear in this way. But what I'm interested in now, there's been a slight switch, and now I'm interested in like the adaptability of nature and the adaptability of it to overcome whatever dumb stuff we're doing to ourselves and to the planet. So it's like, how will nature begin to make use of plastic or our refuse or our waste, or how will nature begin to colonize the spaces that we have made uninhabitable for ourselves? So like at the moment, there's a handful of bacteria that we know about that sort of process plastic and can break it down. But beyond those handful of bacteria, that's kind of it in terms of like making that thing turning into something else. Otherwise, it just gets smaller and smaller and ground up and smaller, and it gets in the ocean, and it's going to become our beaches of the future. But now I'm starting to imagine, my kind of creative artist question is like, oh, well, what else? Like maybe what happens if there's like a symbiotic relationship with like a living organism and some sort of like man-made product or another material of our time? And so the sculptures often involve found objects, manufactured objects, natural materials together into sort of like a strange homunculus or like a chimeric creature that then needs to be wrangled with a spray bottle. Cool. Any other questions? That was a great question. Did I answer that one? Okay, great. So that's, and then there's a show in Autzen. And then at the end of my school year, my final thesis project is I'm proposing to make my version of a sculpture park in the PSU community garden, apiary, and orchard that's on a little pizza wedge over on the east part of, kind of near there's like a 405 on-ramp, and then there's the campus, and then there's this little pizza wedge. So again, it's this weird space that's kind of on the edge of a bunch of things. And it's kind of frazzled and overgrown, and so I'm going to go in there and try to formalize some of these thoughts about my position in regards to the environment, in regards to nature. What do I take? What do I give? What is that kind of oscillation like? So yeah, stay tuned. Any other questions? Anything? Johnny, you got any questions? Cool. Thanks for coming. Later. How am I doing for time, Tia? Do I have like an hour and 40 minutes left?
I wish. We're pretty much out of time, but if you still have more to say, we can add like 5 or 10 minutes or so.
Was there, yeah, unless anyone has any further questions or wants like a little more explication about anything, I would gladly give it. Yeah, sure.
Where are you from? I came in a little bit late.
Oh yeah, no problem. Originally I'm from New England. I was born in Rhode Island and raised in the rurality of New Hampshire. Yeah, and I've lived here for about 10 years.
What kind of music do you make?
All sorts of music. The other day I made some kind of like weird rock and roll, kind of like bluesy jams with some friends, mostly sound collage. And I think collage is like a good way of sort of summarizing a lot of my practice. Sound collage, 3-dimensional collage, bricolage, and then collaging things on 2D space. Yeah. But I've done a lot of things in my time. I used to sing for a hardcore band. Yeah. Jack of all trades, and I'm soon going to become a master of one of them, fine art. So, That seems like the broadest umbrella. Cool. Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I'm around. We can just keep chit-chatting. We can go to the bar. I don't give a shit. Is there anything else going on? Do you want to make any announcements about the museum or anything like that?
About the museum, no. I just wanted to ask everyone if we could give you a round of applause, though.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you all so much.